reminder of what Vygotsky told us? We all learned about Vygotsky in college, right? Kids enter at all different places. We know where we want to take them, and the way we move them from where they actually are to where we want them to be is the zone of proximal development. It's the place where social interaction moves them forward. It's the place where working with others moves them forward. It's what they can do with others in order to do it independently. So it kind of goes back to the reason we put kids in groups is to struggle together a little bit. When you struggle through a challenge, you actually create endorphins. It's just like the runner's high. So it's a good feeling. So we have kids who don't like school. A good way to get them to like school more is to give them interesting challenges to struggle with because it actually changes the way the brain is working. Some of the research about why kids lose traction over the summer is because they're not practicing the same reading skills, for example, during those months. And so it's like muscles atrophy, right? The brain isn't practicing using those skills. So the more they practice challenging tasks, the more they're prepared to do challenging tasks, and the more they feel good about it. Second misconception, Webb's is a taxonomy. That would mean that doing a 4 is better than a 3, and a 3 is better than a 2, and a 2 is better than 1. You better not ever do 1s, right? There's a little video clip of Norman Webb on my website you might want to listen to. He talks about this, and he talks about developing the taxonomy, and it's really not a taxonomy, it's a framework. Bloom's is a taxonomy. Bloom meant it to have layers, and you get to the highest order of thinking. Primary weaknesses we already talked about were the generic verbs and some of the same verbs at different levels. But Webb says this is nominative. It names how you work with content. One is not better than the other, but you better have balance. Balance. He suggests that a summative test, end of unit test, ought to have half of the score points at DOK2. That's conceptual understanding. You should be asking about the main ideas. You should ask about sequencing events. Right? That's important because you want to be sure they were able to read the whole text. But the question that's raised by this is, what are the other half of the score points used for? Are you going to ask a lot of low-level questions? Or are you going to ask one good, juicy, open-ended question that requires some supporting evidence? That would provide some balance, and you would still find out if they know the low-level things because they're pulling evidence from the text to do that. So it's not a taxonomy, but you have to have balance. And a good activity, and I have some tools for that, is to go through your assessments and just decide, is this a DOK 1, a 2, a 3? What you often find is most things in materials that you buy are mostly DOK 1 and 2. I get asked all the time, can you recommend some good assessments? And I said the best assessments are the ones I develop with schools, because we often take things that they have and make them better, add, elaborate. You don't want what I saw in Georgia, where the teacher's first assessment they developed, the 9th grade English teachers, was a 50-question multiple choice test on Romeo and Juliet. And I said, wow, you want kids to hate Shakespeare? Start the year off that way. They'll never want to read it again. And then they did an analysis, and almost every question was a DOK 1 question. And I said, why are you giving kids this text to read? And they said, we want to talk about the social context that creates conflict in families and across groups. And I said, there are no questions on that. I said, get rid of 35 of the questions you have and ask one good essay question, open-ended question, about why you asked them to read that text. And they got it. Of course, they said, but Karin, we have 125 kids a week. How are we going to score all those essays? And I said, well, the first thing you do is you throw out the 6-point rubric or the 4-point rubric, because this isn't that kind of an essay. You have an idea of maybe 4 things you want to see in this answer. Make a 4-point grading scale. What are all the things you want to see if they do it well? Don't worry about grammar, usage, mechanics. That's hard for English teachers, by the way, to look at it and not mind the spelling errors. But if there are 4 points you want the students to make, look for those 4 points. What would a 3 be, a 2, or a 1? Teachers found that they could easily skim and give it a point score, and then it could be translated to maybe a 4 becomes 25 points. So they got the balance back. And we have to think of ways to do that, to make it manageable for grading, but also make it meaningful for what information we get from kids. I want to do at least one more misconception. I have to put the wheel of misfortune up here. Because it's everywhere. I see it everywhere. I see it in this room. I call this the wheel of misfortune because it goes back to the idea that a verb isn't going to tell you a whole lot. Norman Webb says it's what comes after the verb, and I would agree with him that the wheel, and if you look closely at that wheel, you will see some of the same verbs at multiple levels. So what? I spin the wheel and suddenly we're thinking deeply? Usually that doesn't work. I've tried it. I've tried it in my classes, and it's better to describe what's after the verb to let kids know what you expect them to do. So I ask you to think about what cognitive rigor means. If you look up the word rigor, and I think there are a lot of misconceptions about rigor, it's got to be harder. Academic rigor, make it harder for kids so they really hate school. There's no endorphins at all kicking in. Cognitive rigor is the opposite. It's being able to think flexibly, see different perspectives, see many possible solutions. So a misconception is depth of knowledge is just making it harder. Not true. It's about the mental processing you need to solve the problem at hand, to complete the task. And a quick example that I stole from Webb a few years ago and made my own examples from is you start with the same verb. They all start with the word describe. You might say, oh, describing, that's pretty low level on Bloom's taxonomy. Well, if you only had to describe what information was in a graph or a table, that would be a DOK 1. If I teach you how to read a table, I teach you to read the title. And that tells you what's in the graph. You didn't work with the numbers, you haven't done anything with it, but you know how to read the graph or the table. If I ask you to describe how story characters are alike or different, you're making connections. When you make connections and see relationships, cause and effect, compare and contrast, if then, you're at a DOK 2. If I said describe the data or the text evidence that supports your conclusion, your reasoning, or your solution, what would that be in terms of depth of knowledge? Why is that a 3? What are some key words there that tell you it's a 3? Evidence. You need evidence. The evidence has to support what? Your conclusion or your reasoning. So it's not going to be evidence that supports a right there question, right? You've got to interpret something, and your interpretation is what you're using the evidence for. How about the last one? Describe different perspectives on some big issue like global climate change. Use supporting scientific evidence and predict what effects it might have on the planet. Now, if you've been sleeping, you might not know that's a 4. Why is that a 4? What are the characteristics of a depth of knowledge 4? Multiple sources. You have to present those ideas. What else? You think there's a right answer? It would be nice if there was, because we'd be working on it now. There isn't one possible answer. Think of how many verbs you have to use to complete that last task. You probably have to use everything on that wheel to accomplish that. As a matter of fact, as you move from level 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, you're probably using more and more different thinking processes to finally complete the task. So it's not about difficulty. There are hard things like memorize all the lines to a play is harder than memorizing your spelling words. Both of them are memorizing. One's harder. Learning how to ski. I remember going skiing for the first time. I couldn't even get off the chairlift without falling. Then I couldn't figure out how to stand up with those things on my feet. I mean, that was hard. But if you do it enough, it becomes automatic, and then it's easier. So the act of getting off of that chairlift wasn't a complex task. It was just hard in the beginning, and the more I fell off and then didn't fall off, it got easier. So we've got those things that we sort of sometimes confuse difficulty with complexity. You can take a simple text, a wordless text. One really good one is the text by the name of Journey. If you're not familiar with it, you ought to get it. It's won a Caldecott Award. It's a beautifully illustrated, wordless book. Starts out, a little girl is very bored. Nobody in her family wants to do anything with her. She has a crayon. She goes up to her bedroom and she draws a door. And the door opens. And she goes through the door and she has an adventure. And you can do all the levels of thinking with interpretations of that wordless book without being able to read. You can think at deeper levels.